Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one. One where we dive into tons of great stories and books, and another where we just dive into tons of interesting topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn all about Jamestown, the story of Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in the New World. It became Virginia. It became the English colonies. It became the United States of America. You have to start from somewhere, and the story is so unbelievable. We're going to try to put it all together in a 20-minute podcast. It's so fascinating, and yes, it began after the debacle of the lost colony of Roanoke. Definitely go back and listen to that episode, because basically what happened was, with the failure of Roanoke, that led to the failure of Sir Walter Raleigh. His reputation was in tatters, and now Queen Elizabeth, who had sponsored his mission, who had sponsored and pretty much was responsible for his whole career, she passes away. It's 1603, and now there's a new king, King James. This mattered. Why? Because Roanoke was essentially a private venture. Queen Elizabeth gave Raleigh a royal charter. I mentioned that, but it's like a patent. And that granted him personal ownership of this new land. Can you imagine this? The problem was it was all on Raleigh. He had to use his own funds, his own fortune, or convince wealthy friends to pitch in, which is what happened. The problem became when things went wrong, like the fact that there was a war with Spain. His personal resources were stretched thin. He couldn't afford to keep sending ships, and there was no backup plan. Sir Walter Raleigh ran out of money and focus, and obviously, as we know, the whole venture became a debacle. So now enter King James, and he was smart. He realized, that colonizing a brand new world, a continent, was too expensive for one person. So he shifted this idea about financing everything to a company, Virginia Company of London. You got to think of it as an early version of a modern corporation. Instead of one guy owning it, this company sold shares to hundreds of investors, regular people, merchants, ordinary citizens. So what happened? Now, if a ship would sink, no one person would go bankrupt. This shared risk meant the company had a massive pool of capital to keep sending supplies, even when the colony wasn't making a profit yet. It was long-term, and this is what happened. Thankfully, they didn't give up. But this is important to remember. This wasn't about early on, hey, we're going to establish this wonderful new future in this new land, and we're going to colonize it. In fact, in 1606, it was purely driven by profit. Yes, they were looking for three things: gold and silver. They wanted to strike it rich like the Spanish had in South America. The Northwest Passage, this was huge all along during this time. We take it for granted looking back. Northwest Passage? No, that's not possible. But back then, they hoped to find a shortcut through the continent to reach the spice markets of the Orient, in China, in India. Remember, this was the original goal that Christopher Columbus had. So they were still looking for this passageway. And finally, they heard so much about the land and the raw materials. They figured, in addition to possibly finding gold and silver, hey, utilize the timber, the iron, the silk, and ship it back to England to become profitable, to have this company, this Virginia company, make lots of money. So the journey started on December 20th, 1606. 3 ships left England: the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. This was 105 men and boys plus about 40 crew members. They were a mix of laborers, high society guys, soldiers, artisans. No women were on the first journey. And here's something interesting. King James didn't want a leader. He didn't want someone in charge. He wanted a group of men. Ironically, unlike himself, he just figured that the colony would succeed if there was collaboration and not one person that was acting like himself, like the king. So there was this box that he sealed, and orders were that it wasn't to be opened up until they got ashore. And that's what happened. The journey took 4.5 months. For the first 6 weeks, there were storms that basically pinned the whole fleet in the English Channel, keeping them in sight of England. Nothing happened. And listen to this. Our famous Captain John Smith that you will hear about so much, he was arrested and accused of mutiny pretty much almost from the beginning. And he spent most of his voyage in shackles and was nearly executed in the West Indies before some other leaders intervened. And when I say the West Indies, this wasn't a direct route. In fact, following some trade winds, they sailed south first to the Canary Islands to resupply. Then they crossed the Atlantic to the West Indies, to this island called Dominica and present-day Puerto Rico. Stock up, get water, get more food. So finally, they reached the Chesapeake Bay on April 26, 1607, and they stopped off at Cape Henry. This was their first landing. And right from the beginning, they had skirmishes with the Native Americans. The Native Americans were the Powhatans. The chief was Chief Powhatan. They would define so much of what would happen in Jamestown going forward. They spent 2 weeks exploring the area, and then finally, May 13th, 1607, they selected a site 40 miles inland. If you look in a map, there is this peninsula along what they now named as the James River. They chose this spot because the water was deep enough to dock their ships right at the shore. And yes, it offered a strong defensive position against potential Spanish attacks. This was all they were concerned about. Spain didn't want them there, and they didn't want Spain anywhere near them as well. So they were protected far up the Chesapeake Bay, far away enough from any attack by the Spanish. But the problem was the spot that they picked was actually what they called a salt wedge. They were, like I said, 40 miles up the James River, but the water was what they called brackish, which is a mix of salt and fresh water. During the summer, the fresh water flow decreased and the salty tide pushed up from the bay. The settlers were unknowingly drinking salt-contaminated, slimy water. I mean, this was almost like salt poisoning. And you talk about attention, conventions, problems. You had it right from the beginning, but physically they had no idea this was actually making them lethargic, irritable. And on top of this, the original 104 settlers, 50 were considered quote-unquote gentlemen. Their status was defined by the fact that they didn't work. No, they didn't work with their hands at all. Number one, they had no experience. Number two, this was above them. Why they came to begin with, thinking that they were just going to sit back on an easy chair and just watch everyone work. But yeah, the hard work, chopping down trees for the forts, planting crops. Basically, half of the population sat and watched, and you talk about, again, like I said, problems right from the get-go. Now, I mentioned the Powhatans. Here we are right away before they even were able to build homes, unpack. There was this 17-day siege where the Powhatans attacked. One settler was killed, and it terrified them so much that they ended up building a 3-sided fort in just 19 days. They had no time, like I said, to build any of their own homes. They just lived basically in holes in the ground while the walls went up. Now, before the Native Americans attacked, they had to open up this box. And who was in there? Who were the 7 guys in charge? First, it was Christopher Newport. He was the captain of the largest ship, the Susan Constant. Then it was Bartholomew Gosnold. He was the captain of Godspeed. And then it was John Ratcliffe. He was the captain of the Discovery. The 4th man in charge was Edward Maria Wingfield. He was ultimately elected the first president. Then there was this fellow by the name of John Martin. He was a lawyer and investor. There was another guy by the name of George Kendall, who was a soldier, and he was later executed for mutiny. Yes, one of the 7 was brought up on charges of trying to take over, and he was killed. And then the biggest surprise of them all, the guy that was shackled down at the bottom of the ship and was almost killed, was Captain John Smith. I mean, King James, I guess, had a good idea about having no one specific in charge, but really it ended up being a recipe for disaster. Wingfield, he was a quote-unquote gentleman. He despised Smith, and it was Bartholomew that actually had to step in and negotiate the fact that he wasn't going to be executed. Wingfield basically thought that Smith not only was mutinous, but he was this dangerous person who was always looking to take over and get in charge. And Smith, in turn, viewed Wingfield as incompetent and more concerned with his own comfort than the colony's survival. And speaking of survival, it's like an episode right out of the original Survivors on TV. So here's what happened with Wingfield. By September of that year, Ratcliffe, Martin, and Smith got together and they disposed of Wingfield as their leader. They accused him basically of hoarding all of the food, the beef, the wine, the beer in his private tent, while others were starving. So Wingfield was placed under arrest on a ship, and then John Ratcliffe became president. And his story didn't end well either, which brought the rise of everyone that we know about Jamestown. And yes, it was Captain John Smith. He was famous for taking charge, and he said, "You don't work, you don't eat." He was the principle behind keeping this new settlement intact, and it was all about making sure that they could survive, whereas some of the other principles were just looking to make the profit, to find the gold and silver, and Smith was a practical one. Now, Christopher Newport, he left in June to resupply this settlement. Bartholomew Gosnold, a major leader right from the beginning, he passed away early on that summer with so many others. Half of the settlers were gone by the fall. So this was the precarious nature of that first 6 months in Jamestown. You had Wingfield that was banished, sent back to England. You had Newport, who was sent back to England to get supplies. Who knows if he would be back? So with the passing away of Gosnold, that left Smith, Martin, Kendall, and Ratcliffe basically in charge. And then Captain John Smith made a fateful decision. He went up the river looking for food, looking to chart the territory, figure out where he was to help the settlement survive. And he was captured. He was ambushed. Bottom line, he was brought before Chief Powhatan, and yes, he was placed on the ground, and with a club raised above him, he was about to be killed. And Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan, intervened and saved his life. Now, what you have to know is this all came from Captain John Smith's writings that he put down on paper years later. Historians ultimately believe that, yes, this could have been true, but there were ceremonies that were part of bringing other people into a tribe, and this could have been a misunderstanding as to whether or not he was killed or not, or about to be killed or not. But the bottom line is that he wrote that Pocahontas rushed in, placed her head on his, shielded him, and persuaded her father to spare his life. There was not a romantic relationship that most of us think from the Disney movie. All the events that happened in that Disney movie were such that, yes, it was true, but no, there wasn't a romantic relationship. So what happened next? In Smith's version of the events, he was released, he returned to Jamestown, and yes, he continued leading the colony. It's now 1608 in January, and good news, Christopher Newport does return back. He's got food, he's got new settlers, and he saved the colony from starvation. But literally days later after his arrival, no one knows what happened, but there was a spark in the middle of the night while everyone was sleeping. Half the town burned down, including all the food that was stored in one particular house, all the food that was just brought over from England. Just when there was hope, there was despair immediately. Only 3 buildings survived. The winter was harsh. Really, the only reason they ended up surviving was through the kindness of the Powhatans. Pocahontas and her tribesmen visited throughout that winter. They brought corn, they brought animal skins. They basically kept the English alive. So now as we go into the fall of 1608, the settlement has survived, and this is where Captain John Smith was elected president of the council, and he was now definitively in charge. Now, during this time, after the fire, back in April the same year, Christopher Newport went back to England and hoping he actually brought what he thought was gold. They checked it out in England. It wasn't gold, but nevertheless, they still decided that Jamestown was worth it. Newport goes back again, and this time with orders for Smith to capitulate and focus on the gold and silver. With Smith, Newport ends up going to Powhatan. They do a ceremony to convert him, a coronation. It turned into a debacle, and this is when they come back. And Newport, despite his best intentions, realizes that Smith is in charge. He leaves him there, and then Newport goes back again at the end of 1608 to England, this time bringing back practical raw materials, pitch, tar, glass samples, soap ashes, and lumber. And what else did he bring? This letter that was a complete rebuke of what London was trying to do in the New World. It was a letter from Smith. It's amazing that these two ended up cooperating enough to have this whole settlement succeed, because at this point, in the letter that he delivered, Smith basically said that the company's demand for gold and exploring the whole area were unrealistic, and what the colony needed were more farmers, laborers, and forget the gentlemen. If they were going to survive, this is what he wanted. So after Newport gets off the boat, talk about discussions, talk about negotiations, talk about convincing the public that this is what we should be doing. We should invest more in Virginia. We should get rid of Virginia. throw up our hands and just forget it. The three primary people that were responsible for making sure that Jamestown continued were Sir Thomas Smythe, Sir Edwin Sandys, and Robert Cecil. They put together this idea, you know what? This is not working, so we're going to have a new charter. This charter was known as the Second Charter, and here it is officially now in May 1609, and this is what they did. The company took control, the king stepped back, and the Virginia Company became the actual owners. They now could make their own laws. They got rid of the arguing council. Instead, they appointed one powerful governor to rule with an iron fist. This was not good for Captain John Smith. They started a campaign to get more money. They opened up investing to everyone. Smythe, which, by the way, is actually pronounced Smith. He went into union halls. He went into factories. He went into people's homes to get money to convince them that you want to invest in this company. It worked. They said that if they go to Virginia, if they bought a share, they get a big piece of land in 7 years. And to make it even look better, the king said Virginia now went from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean, even though they had no idea how big the continent was. This plan led to the third supply, with Newport going back again. And this time, it was no little affair. It was a massive fleet of 9 ships and 600 people that Newport led back, and it was supposed to be this corporate takeover to save the colony. But at every turn, you think things are going well for Jamestown, and then tragedy strikes again. On their way over, they hit a massive hurricane. It's July 1609. The winds were over 100 miles an hour, 60-foot waves battered the wooden ships. It was complete chaos. The Sea Venture, which was the flagship that had all the important men, the future governors of the settlement, their ship had been rushed into service before all its caulking had been fully set. Can you imagine this? This ship was an accident waiting to happen, and the planks pulled apart. The water began flooding in, and eventually it was 9 feet deep. For 4 days and 3 nights, everyone, including, like I said, the leaders of this venture, pumped and baled water. They threw everything overboard just to stay afloat. Just when they were about to give up, they spotted land. It was Bermuda. To save all the 150 passengers, Christopher Newport deliberately steered the dying ship toward the shore. It was lodged and locked between 2 coral reefs, and that allowed everyone, including a dog, to reach land safely via some of the longboats that were on board. They were stranded for 10 months. On this ship was the future new governor, Sir Thomas Gates. Christopher Newport was there. This admiral, this naval hero by the name of Sir George Somers. But no one knew it at the time. The most important person that was on the ship was John Rolfe, and we'll be hearing a lot about him very soon. Tragically, his wife and infant daughter died while they were stranded in Bermuda, and while everyone was in Bermuda trying to get off the island, finally trying to get back to Jamestown, 7 of the 8 other ships limped into Jamestown. They had the same issues, but their problem was that they brought 350 new settlers with no supplies for 10 months. This was known as the starving time. 10 months, Smith barely hung on, because think about it. All these supplies were supposed to be delivered, but because of the hurricane, they brought just people and nothing. Nothing, no food, But of all the people that came, there were two that were thorn in the side for Smith: John Radcliffe and Gabriel Archer. Gabriel Archer had tried to kill Smith back in the past year, and John Radcliffe, as you know, was not happy with Smith all along. So Radcliffe and Archer arrive saying, Smith, we have a new charter. We're in charge now. And Smith says, show me the paperwork. There was no paperwork because it was on the Sea Venture, which was in Bermuda. Talk about attention convention. Nothing got done and nobody was in charge. And this is how it had to be. But this did not mean that they weren't looking behind their back. All three of them, Radcliffe, Archer, and Smith. It's August 1609. Having no food, no authority, they demanded that Smith step down. Smith refused. That led to the standoff where basically Smith laid some by their heels. What did he do? Yeah, he imprisoned both Radcliffe and Archer, shackled them, confined them, put them aside for opposing his authority, and then mysteriously, you're not going to believe this, 2 months later, Smith is sleeping in a boat on a river, and a mysterious gunpowder explosion tore through a bag sitting right next to him. His leg was nearly ripped off, and a 9-inch square of his skin on his thigh is burning. In agony, he jumps into the river to stop the fire, and he was nearly drowned. And to add insult to injury, while he's laying down in the fort trying to recover, apparently Radcliffe and Archer sent someone in to kill him. The gunman didn't go through it, but the threat was clear. John Smith's time in Jamestown was over. He was sent back to England that month, and he never returned to Virginia. On top of this, now the next month, Radcliffe is in charge, and it's still this starving time in Jamestown. He let a group of 50 men to go off to see Chief Powhatan to trade for corn, and it was a trap. 34 of his men were killed on the spot. Radcliffe was captured and horribly was tortured to death by Powhatan women. I won't get into the details. You can look it up, but it was horrific. And now, here we are going into the spring of 1610, and what happens? The leaders of the colony, the shipwrecked boat that was down in Bermuda, they finally arrive back in the Chesapeake Bay. And as they got off the boat, no one was there. They called out, no one responded. They screamed for people. They ran everywhere they could just to find evidence that somebody was still alive. The fort, it was in shambles. The walls torn down, burned for firewood. The church, once the heart of the settlement, was totally neglected. The roof was failing, the interior picked over, everything was pretty much gone. They gave up, but then Gates, the new leader of the settlement, rang a small bell, still there in the church, and what they saw was one by one living corpse, shadows of men, got up, did their best to cry out, walk. They were so physically wasted that many couldn't stand. Their bones are sticking out of their skin. Their eyes were barely open and trying to focus. They were barely alive, but here they are, finally rescued. The numbers are horrific. In October 1609, when John Smith left, right there, right then, this time period again called the Starving Time, there were approximately 350 to 500 people in the colony. By May of the next year, when Gates arrived from Bermuda, only 60 survivors were there. These were the people that walked out of their beat-up homes, barely walking, barely surviving, and now they were saved. But the problem continued. Why? Because Gates arrived with very little food. They had survived in Bermuda, but they now brought 150 survivors from Bermuda. So now we're talking about basically a little bit over 200 people that needed to continue to try to save Jamestown, but they knew immediately it wasn't going to happen. No food, too many people. They made the decision to abandon Jamestown. They loaded everyone into 4 small ships, buried their cannons. They set sail down the James River, and they were literally down this river just hours after they left. And what did they see? 3 massive sailing ships approaching them. It was a fellow by the name of Thomas West, better known as Lord Delaware. Yeah, that Delaware. You can imagine the shock. You can imagine the surprise. You can imagine the jubilation, but everything immediately came to a halt after the pleasantries, after what happened, what are you doing here, what's going on? Delaware had a mandate. After word had gotten back that the Sea Venture that carried Gates, the new governor, the new charter, all the food had disappeared in a hurricane. Remember, they had no idea that they actually survived in Bermuda and then ended up going and reaching Virginia. Meanwhile, the investors in London that had poured a fortune into this 1609 mission with all the ships that were now gone, they figured they were going to lose everything, so they stopped. Everything changed their approach. They stopped sending captains, merchants, and they sent this gentleman. Yes, Lord Baltimore. This was the Virginia Company's Hail Mary pass. He left London in March 1610, and then, like I said, think about the luck and the fortune of them running into each other. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, because Gates was ordered by Delaware to turn around. Delaware was instructed, and he became a leader, a military leader. It was martial law in Jamestown. So think about where we are now. June 1610, 3 years after they settled Jamestown. John Radcliffe, dead. Archer, dead. Smith, gone. Now the new leaders from Bermuda, you need to turn around. Delaware said, I am in charge. These are my orders. I have food, and you will listen to me. Turn your ships around. This is now the new chapter of Jamestown. It's now brutal. It's martial law. Delaware instituted this laws divine, moral, and martial. Listen to this. If the church bell rang, and it rang twice, and you didn't show up for church, you were whipped. The 3rd time, you were killed. If you stole anything, specifically food, corn, bread, even flowers from a garden, you were tied to a tree and you were starved to death. Horrible, horrific. But during this time, Christopher Newport and Sir Thomas Gates end up crossing the Atlantic, going back to England multiple times, begging for more supplies and money. And for the most part, they were successful. At this point, Sir Thomas Dale, known to history as the Hammer, now he's in charge. Why? Because Lord Delaware ended up in 1611 getting sick. He goes back to England permanently. And now here we are for a couple years. We are almost stable. We are almost self-sufficient. But still, we are not getting along with the Powhatan tribe. Things were still precarious. And a gentleman by the name of Captain Samuel Argall hears a rumor. The chief's favorite daughter, Pocahontas, is nearby visiting a neighboring tribe. He concocts a cold-blooded plan. He bribes a local chief with copper to lure her onto his ship. She thinks she's a guest for dinner. Instead, she hears the anchor rise. She is now a prisoner of war. They didn't kidnap her to be cruel. They kidnapped her for leverage. They held her. Listen to this. They held her for over a year, demanding the return of English prisoners, stolen tools, and more importantly, peace. But Chief Powhatan didn't relent. He didn't give in. There was a stalemate. And while in captivity, Pocahontas, she isn't in a dungeon. She's actually being re-educated. And she meets a man by the name of John Rolfe. You heard about him before. He was defined by tragedy. He was shipwrecked with Newports and Gates in Bermuda. And here he is now. He meets Pocahontas and they fall in love. Yes, whether it's true that it was love that was reciprocal, meaning Rolfe definitely loved Pocahontas, but here it is, Pocahontas is being kept against her will. To what extent does she really love this new man? But nevertheless, they were married. Rolfe struggled with this because at the time, you're a Christian and you can't really marry someone outside of the faith. But he got blessings from the local clergy, and here they are. They're now married. And remarkably, Chief Powhatan agreed to this. In the native tradition, if you had a stranger that married into the tribe, the English were now no longer invaders. They were like technically part of the Powhatan family. This was all negotiated over a span of a year. The bottom line is the English got what they want. The Powhatans got what they want. Each of them had their own issues and weaknesses. And now there was peace. Finally, there was peace in Jamestown. They ended up having an infant son, Thomas. Again, that name Thomas. It's a couple years later in 1616, they sailed with Thomas Gase back to England. They were treated as celebrities, Pocahontas and Thomas. And tragically, when they came back from England shortly afterwards on the boat in 1617, Pocahontas passed away. She was only 20 years old. Likely, historians think it was likely an acute respiratory illness, something like pneumonia or tuberculosis. But other accounts, maybe it was dysentery, smallpox. And the Native Americans, some of them believed that she was actually poisoned. Bottom line, she fell gravely ill right after she was put on the boat to come back to her native land. So tragic. Now, to wrap up the podcast, the success of Jamestown was all about John Rolfe, all during this time. Yes, Pocahontas was important. Yes, Captain John Smith was important. All the resupply ships, all the hardships, all the perseverance. But sometime while he was in Bermuda, John Rolfe ended up getting his hands on some sweet tobacco seeds. No one knows how he got them, but he got them. And how he got them to Virginia, no one will know. And how he got them to begin with, he never said. And no one ever found out. Why? Spain controlled the tobacco trade. And if you were caught with these seeds, you were sentenced to death. Anyone selling them to non-Spaniards were history. Theories through the years have been wild, but historians basically have put their flag down with the fact that maybe he traded with another captain from another ship from maybe Trinidad or Venezuela, or perhaps He maybe scavenged them from a Spanish shipwreck that whole 10 months while he was in Bermuda. But it was clear he got them while he was shipwrecked. And this transformed everything about the tobacco. The tobacco grew, and it grew well in the Virginia soil. And so here's the thing as to why this became the turning point. The tobacco plants that were native to Virginia were horrible. They were bitter. They were not popular. Now, Rolfe, going backwards here, it was around 1612 that he had his first harvest. Now, the success wasn't immediate. 2 years of perfecting, trying, failing. March 1614, the first shipment of 4 barrels of his sweet tobacco arrived in London. This was the same year he had married Pocahontas. And remember, this was key. This was the turning point. The marriage brought the peace that was needed to clear more land, and the tobacco brought the profit needed to keep the investors happy, and more people ended up coming to Jamestown. They made more money. Hey, between 1617 and 1619, after his return to Virginia, after losing Pocahontas, 1617, he was able to export 20,000 pounds of tobacco. It was grown everywhere, even in the streets of Jamestown. A year later, it doubled to 40,000 pounds of tobacco. Rolfe's gamble effectively broke the Spanish monopoly, and by 1619, Jamestown had pivoted from a military fort to a one-crop economy. It was finally successful. It was finally on the map, and tragically, the hero of Jamestown, John Rolfe, number one, his son Thomas, he was so young they didn't think he was going to make the voyage back to the New World. After Pocahontas, his mother passed away. He left Thomas in England with his brother Henry. And then when he returned, John Rolfe never saw his young son again. Why? After all the success, our hero of Jamestown died only 5 years later in 1622 at the young age of 37. The exact cause of his death is still really unknown today. Many believed he was killed in an Indian massacre on March 22nd, 1622. Ironically, it was led by Pocahontas' uncle. Other historians believe that he actually died of an illness weeks before the attack. But nevertheless, here, John Rolfe is no longer alive. Now, a few final thoughts. The legacy of Jamestown, the legacy of John Rolfe, Captain John Smith, everyone, is complicated. No doubt the success ended up hinging on tobacco and the resilience of these first settlers, but think about what also Jamestown had with its arrival. Slavery. The first slaves were brought over forcefully from Africa to help with the cultivation of the tobacco leaves. And think about also what happened. The fact that our first permanent settlement was built on the back of this crop, this addictive crop, tobacco. Its main ingredient is nicotine. And from this point forward, remember that this wasn't a thing. Tobacco, smoking, prior to Columbus coming over. It wasn't a thing in Europe. But what this led to was hundreds of millions of lives that were lost from smoking. They didn't know it at the time, obviously, but now we knew better. And thankfully, so many people don't smoke anymore. But nevertheless, generations, including my own family, smoked for years. And this was a horrible legacy, of course. But Jamestown is an amazing story. It was a story of desperate pivots, turning points, salvations. What began as almost a ghost colony of starving rivals, people that were constantly, literally and figuratively at their throats, living corpses. It was transformed by the arrival of new disciplined leadership. Started with Captain John Smith. It went all the way through Lord Delaware and Sir Thomas Dale. But the bottom line is with the diplomatic marriage of Pocahontas and John Rolfe, this global success of his tobacco crop, the settlement, Jamestown, finally moved on from being a failed military outpost. We started in 1607, but by 1619, Jamestown laid the foundation for our future of American democracy industry, proving that even a colony built on the brink of collapse could endure to become the permanent cornerstone of our new wonderful nation. Friends, thanks for staying with me on this longest podcast of OK, Let's Learn. It was worth it. 45 minutes. I thought we could put it together in 20 minutes, but no, it wasn't going to happen. Too much happened. But here it is, in one place you can learn all about the amazing story of our beginnings in Jamestown, Virginia. Reach out to me at KEVMOK21@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group, OK, Let's Learn. We have a YouTube channel, OK, Let's Learn. Always love the reviews, always love the ratings. Hit that plus button in the top right-hand corner. You'll be subscribed to the podcast, get all new episodes. We're trying to get one out every couple days. Until next time, have fun and keep learning.